Good evening. How is everyone? It's great to see you here, and I'm very pleased by this very large crowd. I heard there's a basketball game in town, so that you're still coming. I'm very impressed by, I must say. Tonight is a special event because it's our first event which we are organizing with the Kenan-Flagler Business School and the Kenan Institute. So I'm very pleased about this cooperation, and hopefully we can cooperate on future events soon. Again. My name is Klaus Laris. I'm the Richard M. Krasno Distinguished Professor of History and International Affairs here at the University of North Carolina in Chapel Hill. For those of you who are not familiar with the Krasno event series, and there may be some from the business school who have not come here before, let me just briefly inform you that we run this series of lectures, talks, movie showings sometimes, and discussions since 2012. We have discussions about politics, international politics, security, economics, and related issues. We have three strands. That is our Ambassadors Forum and Distinguished States Person Forum. Then we have a strand called the United States in the World, dealing with American foreign relations. And we have a new forum entitled U.S. China Europe. And here, obviously, we are discussing the trilateral relations among these three important countries and continents. And that is, of course, the strand we are covering today. Also, we have a mailing list, and I think the mailing list is being circulated right now. So if you would like to be informed about all our forthcoming events, then please put your name and your email address on this mailing list, and I will transfer it to our electronic mailing list, and will inform you by email what is coming up. And I can assure you, we will not pass on your details to any third parties like the CIA or any other organizations which may have an interest. We also have a website, that is the website www.krasnoevents.com, Krasno with a K, and there, of course, you can also see what is happening. And lastly, we have our famous YouTube channel, youtube.com/KrasnoUNC, and we videotape all our events. And if you can't make it, or if you live too far away, or if you would like to see it again, then please watch our YouTube channel regularly. All our events are there. It's great viewing on a, let's say, gray weekend. Tonight, our special guest is Sitao Xu from Beijing, from Deloitte China. He is the Chief Economist and Partner at Deloitte China, based in Beijing. Sitao and I met in Beijing a few months ago when I was working at the German embassy, and Sitao was slaving away as an economist in Beijing. We were introduced by a mutual friend, and ever since we have kept in touch. We have had a few coffees and a few meals together, and I came very quickly to the conclusion that Sitao would be an excellent speaker to our series, and he happened to be in the United States. He's talking to some other venues in DC, in Philadelphia, and Baltimore, and elsewhere, so I was able to lure him to Chapel Hill as well. Thank you very much for coming. At Deloitte China, Sitao leads Deloitte's Economic and Industry Research section. And prior to Deloitte, he was the chief representative China for the Economist Group. He also worked in Singapore for the Standard & Poor Group, and he has worked for Standard Chartered Bank and other very prestigious organizations. He has also written many policy articles, and he can regularly be seen on CNN, CCTV, Bloomberg television, and other media outlets. Sitao was educated at Peking University in Beijing, and he also got degrees from the University of Connecticut and from Boston College. As you can see, he's not totally unfamiliar with the United States. After Sitao's talk, we will have a panel discussion, and then we open it up to questions from you, the audience. And as always, I expect a most lively and engaged discussion, of course. And all your many questions are already well received. We have a panelist today from the business school, that is Professor Christian Lundblad. Christian Lundblad is the Richard Levin Distinguished Professor of Finance at the Kenan-Flagler Business School here at UNC. And he is also Associate Dean for the PhD program. He runs the research center, and he does many, many other things, which I really can't just list here. He is an expert on investment management, including international finance, with a specialty in emerging market developments. He also focuses on hedge fund analysis and global financial markets. He has published in many leading journals, and he also worked for the Federal Reserve Bank in Washington, D.C. And he also is a special term professor at Tsinghua University in Beijing, I noticed when I read your CV, and that was particularly interesting for me, as I'm also a visiting professor at Tsinghua University, though not in the Department of Finance, I must admit. Before we come to Sitao Xu to talk to us about the trade war between the United States and China, I would like to pass briefly on to Professor Greg Brown from the Keenan Institute of the Keenan-Fleckner Business School. Professor Brown.
Thanks, Klaus. I'm just going to take 1 minute just to, first of all, thank you for organizing this and inviting us to join you, and very glad to be here and hope we get to do this more often in the future. Probably most of you know Keenan-Flagler Business School. I don't know if you all know the Keenan Institute. We're sort of the outreach arm of the business school. So we're a nonpartisan business policy think tank. We work with affiliated centers at the business school doing a wide range of things. So we have economic development work in Eastern North Carolina. We have an energy center. We have a private capital center. So we really work with faculty primarily in the business school, but also around other parts of campus doing all sorts of projects, research projects, outreach projects, policy-oriented work as well. And we are always welcoming students from different parts of campus to come join in our programming. So feel free to check out our website, see what we're up to, and please join us. So with that, back to you. Thanks, Klaus.
Thank you very much, Greg. And now, ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Sitao Xu from Deloitte China. And Sitao,
thank you very much. I know this evening is indeed difficult with this game, but it's not a marquee opponent by any means from what I am known. But anyway, thank you so much. Thank you, Klaus, for being a very gracious host. The subject I'm going to talk about really trade war between China and the United States. I must confess, until a year ago, even 6 months ago, if you ask diplomat, analyst, economist, really no one could foresee where we are today, right? Because within 2 months, by January 2019, we could see 25% tariffs on almost more than 50% of Chinese exports. Even the measures to be taken by China, I think will be very measured. Measures to be taken will be very measured. This is still worse than most people have anticipated. So I think, for China, this has been a big deal. No matter where I go, right, well, it's always trade war. The Chinese government actually tried to avoid using the word war. So what other, Chinese are very good at using different language. So tensions, trade tensions, normally trade conflict, misunderstanding. So, but this is really a trade war. But as my heading says, this is not Cold War. Cold War definition of Cold War, Klaus is the expert. Cold War is really about two countries fighting, proxy wars. Chinese don't want to do that. Most Chinese, they only care about the money. So, no, it's actually very true. It's very true. I do have a lot of friends in UNC Chapel Hill, including faculties. They are so obsessed with scientific research. At the same time, they are so obsessed with money. True, really, just like Chinese leaders. And I'm in the long run, I'm still optimistic. I think this is a rivalry. So let me just show you a few charts. As you can see, Chinese economy has really gone a long way. Right now, if US is 100, China is 70. China is 70, right? So at some point, China will surpass United States. It's a matter of time. But even by the time China reaching the level of United States, based on per capita, China is still a lot smaller, right? China's population is roughly 4 times of US population. But China is also the biggest trading country. Now, so long ago, the biggest trading country is your country, Germany. But today, China is bigger than Germany as a trading nation. So economy is quite open. When we say openness, really, we look at external sector, import, export in relation to GDP. US is about 25, China is 45. So that's why trade war is hurting China in the short run than to the United States. China is also an industrial powerhouse. A lot of people, they don't know, if we just really measure in old economy, so for example, steel making, right? President Trump is very obsessed with steel. So China accounts for more than 50% of global steel production. But the capacity, when I say capacity, actually is more than 50%. Okay? So shipbuilding, any white goods, brown goods, China in general, more than 50% of global production. Why I want to talk about old economy? Because this is something President Trump really he really wants to boost, revitalize the old economy of the United States. But China wants to shrink the old economy, right? Shrink the old economy. But the Chinese culture is very different from US culture, right? In the United States, when you talk about reform, creative destruction, you start holding over again. But Chinese culture is more gradual, right? This gradualism also produces a problem between China and the United States, because you can see if the old economy is so dominant in certain sector, pick any sector, if China doesn't make money, no one would make money, right? It's really just, if you think about this, if China doesn't make money, no one would make money. So that's why, we have this, that's one of the reasons for us to have this trade tension. If we compare China with other emerging markets, China, India. India is a very, very good story. I'm very bullish on India, but Indian economy is only 25% of the Chinese economy. Now, if we compare China with other emerging markets, on this chart we have Brazil, Indonesia, Turkey, Argentina. Argentina used to be a very rich country. 100 years ago was richer than the United States. But now, most of these countries, they have not become developed countries. See, there's another reason, in my opinion, right now, this is rivalry, because China didn't follow exactly classical textbook, right? So-called Washington consensus, smaller government, lower taxes. But past 30 years, what China has done, I think by any yardstick, is a miracle. In this university, clearly people want to talk about innovation. China has done quite well, right? Particularly digital economy. It's not that easy to define so-called digital economy. My definition of new economy in China, about 30% of our economy is still growing very fast. There are a few reasons for China to do well in this space. I think because, for example, financial service in countries like the United States, traditional service providers are doing quite a good job. But in China, commercial banks, they don't do a good job. So fintech now is developing so fast. People are just bolder. They are willing to try new things, young people, right? So to give you an example, people in their 30s in urban China, and they rarely go to physical stores. They buy everything online. People in China, they have very low regard to privacy. Also because the system, until a few years ago, when you meet a Chinese, the first question is always, how much do you make? These days, people don't ask those questions. But if I visit my friends in North Carolina, UNC, even professor may ask me, how much do you pay for your apartment? Chinese are always, so I think there are many reasons for e-commerce, a new economy, to develop so fast? As I said, China will surpass the US as the biggest economy, but it's not going to be as soon as people anticipated, assuming the growth rate in the US is 2.5%. I don't know whether that's realistic. I think 2.5 US can do that. As I said, China is 70% of US. Let's say China can do 5%, I think 5%. So we're talking about 2035, 2040, China will surpass US. So there's still a long time, right? Still a long time. But China's chief challenge is not just a bigger economy. As I said, what's important is per capita GDP, right? So country like Denmark, Sweden, they're doing so well. Not overall economy. Economists, when they look at per capita GDP, the threshold is really 12,000 to 15,000. China right now is around 9,000 per head. Why 12,000, 15,000 so important? If we study history, when you reach 12,000, 15,000, there will be institutional changes. For example, when South Korea had a democracy after Seoul Olympic Games in 1988. So China's challenge is really to go from 9,000 to 12,000 and 15,000. At the same time, to avoid this middle income trap. I showed you earlier, all these countries like Argentina, Brazil, South Africa. And for that, we just need to talk about China model. I mean, this is my own definition, was the China model, right? Then we talk about rivalries between China and the United States. I have listed 5 characteristics of China model. I think the first characteristic is this is not a market economy by any means. It's a socialist economy. Part of the economy, you have very, very ferocious competition. And part of the economy, a lot of government intervention. Chinese government is calling that socialist economy with Chinese characteristics, which I agree. Secondly, China wants to have stability. I think China probably emphasizing stability a little bit too much. Emphasizing on stability, in my opinion, is an implicit tolerance of corruption because you basically allow different prices in one sector simultaneously. So that allow people to have, I call that regulatory arbitrage. So stability also means tolerance of corruption. Oh, by the way, I think for China, culturally, we do tolerate corruption. I often say this, if you ask most Chinese, do you prefer a politician who is corrupt or capable, or politician who is very clean but mediocre? Most Chinese probably prefer a corrupt politician who can get a job done. China model also means you got first-class infrastructure. I don't know. I know some of you, Professor Christian, you go to China a lot. Even you go to third-tier city, not Chapel Hill, right? When we say third-tier city, normally size of population. I mean, it's not condescending, right? Just the size of population. So in general, meaning population less than 2 million third-tier cities. You'll be impressed, I think, by infrastructure, airport, and all this. So why China believes in that? I think from China's perspective, good infrastructure is a precondition for sustainable development. And so far, Chinese leaders have been very pragmatic. The famous line by Deng Xiaoping is, I don't care whether the cat is black or white, so long as it can catch mice. So the question is, going forward, whether Chinese leaders would remain pragmatic. I mean, that's an open question. I think earlier I said, right, in economics we deal with trade-off. I think in China, trade-off is economic liberalism versus political control. So if you ask most Chinese leaders, what would be the perfect country? I would say, quietly, they say, we want to have a Singapore at large. You go to Singapore, I'm sure you understand what I'm saying. Singapore at large, meaning political leaders, they are smarter than the rest of the country. And they act as parents. They want to promote economic development, but at the same time, they don't like criticism. So far, Singapore has been able to do that. But going forward, maybe that's a challenge, right? Because even younger people may not like when leaders, they behave with some sort of moral superiority. But that's what China wants. And this is just a chart showing you China's high-speed rail. You can see high-speed rail now goes everywhere. Now, if you use Western logic, you will say, how come we don't have high-speed rail, for example, between Sydney and Melbourne, these two very vibrant, large cities in Australia? Because, well, based on the logic of business community, the rate of return. But in China, I think the system has been set in such a way they are willing to sacrifice the rate of return or less desirable, lesser return in order to have the sustainable development. Now I would like to really talk about this ongoing conflict or potential conflict between China model and US model. This famous cover page of Economist magazine is about Chinese leader, right? Chinese leader. On this cover magazine, you can see if you remove, give him facelift, is quite red. So, the article essentially saying Chinese leader Xi Jinping now is taking country to the left, being a strongman. Now that's very different from what people in the West have anticipated, because the assumption so far is economy is becoming larger and stronger and middle class than political opening is. But in China, so far, that has not happened. Not only has not happened, and the current Chinese leader really wants to even increase political control through, for example, social credit system and so on and so forth. So I think it's really an open question how long this current dichotomy would persist in China, meaning you have a very vibrant economy, at the same time, political interference, political control. I just want to say one thing, right? One thing, I think cultural differences do matter. In a country like United States, when you want to boost the economy, I think the first thing is tax cut. I think everyone wants tax cut. But in China, which is not a democratic society, I think tax cut can never happen. So why would the politicians cut taxes, right? Until today, even until today, if you go to Ministry of Finance, you will say, can I see the budget? Then Minister of Finance will say, why do I have to show you budget? There's no such a budget, right? It's not on website. So in China, tax cut will never happen because political control. So what China is doing, really subsidy. So for example, if I want to help a company in North Carolina, I don't cut tax. I say, okay, I give you this piece of land for free, and I give you this incentive. So in a way, it's actually culture. But right now, this is a major source of trade war between China and the United States. Because from US perspective, subsidies from the Chinese government to state-owned enterprises and really distorting competition. And because China is so dominant in traditional industry, as I said, if China doesn't make money, no one makes money. So now if we look at so-called U.S.-China trade tensions, first of all, I think this is going to be a new normal. It's just going to be with us for many years to come. But let's just look at some data. I mean, you can see this is what China is selling to the U.S. This is what what's U.S. selling to China. So roughly it's a 3-to-1. So U.S. selling to China is about $160 billion a year, and China 3 times that, $500 billion. So that's a huge gap. That's what Donald Trump has been saying. China is ripping us. China is ripping us off, and all this. But we all know in global economy, bilateral trade imbalance doesn't mean anything, and not just only trade imbalance. What really matters is current account balance, which including services. So if we look at current account balances, used to be, as you can see, 10 years ago, about 10% of GDP. So 10 years ago, and most countries were criticizing China for being a predator and really just having a very undervalued currency or cheap currency, but that's no longer the case. And this year, China's current account surplus over GDP will be 0, and next year could be negative. So it's actually very difficult to criticize China on trade balances. But why this trade war has persisted for so long, I still think right now China and United States, they are using very different languages. In Chinese, we say 鸡同鸭讲, the dialogue between chickens and the ducks. They look like, but they use very different language. So what China is saying, Han, we really want to buy more American product, but they don't sell us technology, for example, which is true. And China is saying, you look at all this global supply chain, Apple example, not just Apple, GE, Caterpillar, and all this. So China only benefiting very little, that's also true. And then China is saying, if you look at the relationship between China, United States, or China, Japan, United States, in other words, putting all these countries in North Asia as one entity versus United States, this trade deficit would disappear. That's also true, right? And what US is saying to China is, we've been engaging you when you were emerging market. Now you claim as the second largest economy, at the same time, the largest emerging market. That's contradictory, which is also true. And the subsidies to state-owned enterprises, very difficult to quantify subsidies, right, to state-owned enterprise, really distorting the market. And intellectual property right infringement and forced technology. By the way, normally when US criticizing China is about forced technology transfer. So I have American company and unwillingly transfer technology to Chinese partner. In past 3 years, in the United States, whenever I talk to policy wonks or government officials, the word is always being reciprocal, right? Fairness, and roadmap. But again, those things are very difficult in Chinese language because Chinese culturally, we simply cannot accept this roadmap. Roadmap meaning you are being tied up to do certain things, right? Chinese, normally they say, we don't really trust lawyers. So I think this is this is a problem, and clearly China has been misreading United States. Why misreading? Because in the past, U.S. criticizing China during the election. It happened in Bush, Clinton, Obama, and Donald Trump. And secondly, China felt business community always on China's side. But so far, actually, that's not true. Business community, Wall Street, have been relatively quiet. And the final point is lack of urgency on the China side, because China felt we can wait, right? What happened after midterm election? What happened if the US stock market falls? Which is also true. By the way, on US stock market, if you just do some simple correlation between China-US trade and the Dow Jones, S&P 500, I actually think just this development can move the market by 800 to 1,000 points within a couple of days. So if we look at U.S.-China history, the issue is whether we can escape this so-called to this status trap, right? This famous book written by this Harvard professor, Graham Allison, is about the rivalry between number one and number two. Now, in 1972, China-U.S., right, Nixon made a famous visit. 1979, Deng Xiaoping visited the United States when he was merely the deputy prime minister, but he was given red carpet treatment. I mean, everyone in the US knew he was the boss. And after he went back to China, China invaded Vietnam, a very bloody war between China and Vietnam. So then China really became part of the United States because to fight the proxy war with Soviet Union. 1999 was a very important year. That year, NATO, led by US, bombed Chinese embassy in Belgrade, Yugoslavia. But also in that year, China had a negotiation on WTO. When China's prime minister visiting United States in year 2000, he actually said, I'm here just to provide some comforter to an American counterpart. 2001, China joined the WTO. 2011, Obama's pivotal Asia, that was very significant. Trump visits China November 2017. So now things to watch, really, the upcoming G20 meeting in Argentina, whether the meeting between Xi and Trump would go well or not. So we are watching that. I'm still relatively sanguine about this because I think the stake is so huge. I also think the pressure or the asks from Donald Trump, they are in line with China's domestic reform agenda, not in the short run, but in the long run. Not in the long run. I often ask you, people like Klaus, I mean, we've been saying this, right? You and people in Europe, EU, I always ask them this question. Do you think Trump is a rude person? Most people say, oh, he's very rude, he's very crude, and sometimes people say he's morally ambiguous. Anyway, I don't want to get into that. But then I ask people in Europe, do you think he has got a point on China? And most people say he has got a point on China. So he's rude, he has got a point. So what I've been saying to Chinese leader is, ultimately, what's coming from the United States is no different from what's coming in Europe. They don't care about the trade deficit or trade surplus. What they want is better market access. Let me just give you a small example, right? I see a lot of US companies in China. This year, I had a long meeting with Fox 21. So Hollywood studios, they are selling American movies, showing American movies. Right now, 34 movies a year, only 34 because ideology, censorship, so on and so forth. Now the negotiation has stopped because of trade war. Now, in 1930, 1940, over 350 American movies were shown in Shanghai. So that's just one example showing you consumers' demand being artificially curtailed. At the same time, there is really massive room for market openness. Improved intellectual property is difficult to be quantified, but I do think in certain sectors, China could really get rid of the JV requirement. Example like what you have seen with the German companies BASF, BMWs. So I've been saying this to Western companies precisely because this trade war. It's time for you to drive a hard bargain in China. And finally, I think we should lower tariffs. Earlier I showed you the number. The trade between China and US is $500 billion US dollars versus 160. The average tariff rate in the United States is about 2.5%. China is about 8%. So hypothetically, if these two countries can just sit down saying, okay, let's have zero tariffs, it's actually a wash. It's not a big deal. So in the end, I think China will make concessions, not because external pressures, but really I think that's in line with China's long-term interest. And how can China move from middle income trap? I'm going to quickly close this. First of all, we really have we have a long way to go to open up the market. And domestically, we do have some challenges. Challenges about previous stimulus, debt, domestic debt. So deleveraging is very important. Deleveraging meaning tighten up your belt, and also meaning getting equities from foreigners. I always say getting more money from foreigners. But in order to get money from foreigners, you cannot just cheat them. I mean, you can cheat them once. So you really want to open up the market. And this consumption-driven growth model, you need a better external environment. See, in the past, when China was growing so fast, the assumption was demand in the West was unlimited. But that demand is wrong, right? That demand is wrong. And China also has to narrow the gap between urban China, rural China. So the best policy for China to do is to clean up her own house. I want to show you a few books. Normally, I want to show these book covers to business people. I think this is a good list for people to understand China, United States. The Beautiful Country and the Middle Kingdom, written by a very good U.S. journalist from Washington Post, is about this love and hate relationship in past 300 years. It's fascinating. I think Hank Paulson's book, Dealing with China, right? Dealing with China, is a very good book between China and Wall Street. But now he has changed his stance. If you read his speech in Singapore on Bloomberg conference last week, 2 weeks ago, this war, number one, number two, I think, I don't want to read too much into that, but it's a good book to read. And finally, Asian Godfathers. I don't want to say Chinese leaders are like mafias, but I think Chinese leaders, they behave like Chinese businessmen. And in general, they take the view, if things can be resolved by money, they can do that. So why this relationship is not a Cold War? As I said, even Chinese leaders, they don't believe in ideology. They only care about money. So China, United States, can this country be friends? I think it's going to be difficult to be friends, but they must be partners, right? So you don't have to be friends, but you can be partners, because on so many issues, climate change, North Korea, you need to work together. So how often, history is just taking strange turns. I give you one example. I came to the United States in 1986, and I had a lot of friends from Taiwan. They were always cautious when I was talking to them because they were so afraid. And what they have told me could be reported to Taiwanese government because a lot of spies sent by Taiwanese government. In 1985, the president of Taiwan actually sent someone to kill a journalist in California. But in 1988, Taiwan lifted the martial law, right? The president felt opposition party could be good, and he decided to disallow his children from involving in politics. South Korea is another example after Seoul Olympics. Again, I want to give the example after the NATO bombing of Chinese embassy. A lot of people were very worried about the U.S.-China relationship, but China got into WTO. So to end my sharing with you, I actually felt Donald Trump is the best thing ever happened to us. Because if there's no Trump, maybe today we still live in bubbles. Without Trump, and we have local government, like in North Carolina, they get into all kind of crazy activities. And the housing market will continue to boom, but then the bubble would burst. Some of the recent development between China and Japan, for example, investing in third country, I think that's positive development. So again, I think we have to thank Donald Trump for doing that. So that's why I often say this to my Chinese friends, Chinese leaders. Do you prefer beautiful lies or ugly truths? So again, right, this developer, by no means he's highly educated. He's using very simple language. But his simple message is, if you want to compete with us, why don't you treat your domestic consumers better? So in a way, he makes sense. So I think I should stop right here, right? Because I think ultimately concessions will be made. Then the market may rally.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Sitao, thank you very much for the very interesting, very inspiring talk. I'm not quite sure if you're right that people prefer ugly truths to beautiful lies. I think there's a lot to be said for beautiful lies. That's there. And whether or not China will be thankful to President Trump, I also wonder whether that theory is really all that convincing, but we can discuss it in a minute. Let me ask you, one of the issues President Trump, and indeed, as you rightly said, I think the Europeans complain about is intellectual property theft. be it by the Chinese purchase of Western know-how company, or by the insistence on joint ventures when Western companies want to open business in China. How is that seen in China? Is that complaint realized that has a lot of validity, or is it just dismissed as a Western ploy that they don't know what they're talking about?
I think increasingly China taking that more seriously for several reasons. I give you, again, I want to use entertainment culture industry as an example, right? If you look at, I mean, people all like us, right? When we buy DVDs and CDs, as you know how much they cost in China, right? First of all, these days only foreigners buying those, and Chinese they use this. They didn't, right? This stream, they don't buy that. Secondly, I think when you look at the impact of IPR infringement, think about who is the victim. I would argue, actually, in certain ways, China is a victim. Think about why this. I mean, sounds counterintuitive, right? If you have a very good product from Hollywood and being sold in China far below cost, I mean, the domestic producers, they never got a chance, right? Content producers. So why do you want to buy them if you have good product being sold far below market? So I think China slowly realized that, right? It's in China's best interest to do that. This is very much also related to technology transfer or forced technology transfer. Ultimately, I really think China has to get rid of JV requirement in auto sector. Again, it's in China's best interest. You know why it's in China's best interest? If we don't do that, we will have overcapacity in all these so-called promising sectors. Then what do? You want to dump this in other market? They won't allow you to do that, right? So why foreigners can help us? Because no government will be willing to bail out foreigners. So foreigners' involvement in those industries would reduce political interference. So China slowly figured that out.
So in the future, you see no joint venture requirements anywhere in China?
No, I wouldn't go that far. Right? I mean, but slowly, I think those JV requirements will be eroded. Or, as I said earlier, China doesn't believe this radical approach is always gradualism. So for example, you and I, we have a JV requirement, but Chinese may say, okay, now if you have another company elsewhere, electric vehicle, I don't have to get involved. So you can have your own establishment.
All right, thank you. Chris?
Yeah, so let's follow up on exactly that. So you're talking about IPR improvements in intellectual property rights. So my understanding is there's actually already a significant amount of progress being made in IPR rules and patenting rules and things. And I guess it's sort of in the interest as you have an aspiration to move up the value chain and ultimately be doing more in terms of research and development and technology. So what's your sense of kind of the development of the process of intellectual property rights? And I mean, it's not just a concession, it's actually in the interest in terms of the institutional development at home, right? Yeah. So how's that coming along? Is it in an early stage? Is it at a medium stage? I mean, what's your sense?
Maybe between early to medium stage.
Mm-hmm. Okay. This is a slightly higher altitude, but still related to this. So we've got intellectual property concerns. We've got currency considerations. We've got joint venturing concerns. I understand that there is a medium to long run alignment in some sense, with that being associated with kind of the right direction for China to reach kind of escape velocity on the middle income trap. But how much of that would be perceived in the short run as a concession to the United States? Is there a political cost to doing that at home? What's your view on suppose in Argentina, Xi gives Trump everything he wants. I mean, what's that going to look like at home?
This is Chatham House rules, right? I mean, no journalist, everything, right? I mean, actually on record, I mean, I've been saying my approach actually is appeasement. I understand the connotation of appeasement, right? The connotation. I think if China made concession. See, because a year ago, I did say this on record. I said China should do a few things. First of all, China should give Trump some headline wins. I mean, if this guy has got big ego, just give him headline wins, right? It's easy. My second.
But those can be without consequence. You could just give them a headline win. I mean,
headline wins.
So you
headline
want some?
wins.
I'm asking if there's something.
No, headline wins. Headline wins because headline wins could be I don't know. I mean, 20,000 jobs being created in Wisconsin, for example, or in North Carolina. Okay.
It's a drop in the bucket.
yes.
Interesting. So I do want to push you on one thing, which is is whether what the president is asking for is kind of commensurate with this kind of direction that maybe is a legitimate claim from the perspective of where both China ought to go and where the outside is expressing frustration. I mean, my sense is there's two schools of thought that are being expressed inside the United States administration, and they're fighting like mad right now. And there's not a lot of clarity in terms of who's winning the day. So on the one hand, there's maybe somebody that has kind of the long run perspective that if we really push China hard, we may indeed get them to open up and alleviate some of these problems. And we can argue about whether this is the right roadmap to get there or not. But at least I think many of us would agree with the end goal. And then there's sort of that expressed by others, and there's some other books that you didn't put up there, like Peter Navarro's, for example, which are just, we need to have a divorce from China, full stop. Right. We don't want to do business with these guys, they're unfair, and that's it. And I think those two forces are fighting, and I'm not really sure who Trump is listening to right now,
So to give you an example, right? So Trump and Xi had a call, I think 2 days before midterm election. But when he made a call, I don't think he told any of these people, Lighthouser, Ross. I mean, no one knew. So I don't think people really. I think even people in the U.S. find him less predictable, right? Less predictable. So, yeah, no, true. I mean, he didn't tell anyone. He made a call. I think he was very thrilled when stock market going up, when China's Asia market coming down, then he can tweet, and our market is doing much better than your market, right? So he does that a lot. I think a lot of people, for example, Hank Paulson, these people, they are sophisticated, but I don't think even they know if you push China too hard, maybe you'll punish those who are for reform, right? I don't think this is just too much analysis. I think right now most people, they seem to think just more pressure to China is justifiable, right? I think that's right now, even tomorrow there's no Trump, I don't think the trade policy from the US will change dramatically.
Thank you. The trade war really is not just about trade.
No,
it's a wider conflict.
Yeah.
One issue would be the South China Sea, where the United States also has serious complaints about Chinese claimed to 80-90% of the South China Sea.
Right.
We know in 2016 the UN arbitration court in The Hague declined and rejected all of these claims by China, but the Chinese have decided to ignore the court and insist that that is really their backyard.
Yeah.
How do you see that can be resolved? That seems to be even more intractable than the actual trade war.
Yes, you're absolutely right. South China Sea could be a potential flashpoint precisely for the reasons you have given. Not only that, when President Xi visited the United States, I think he has made some promise to Obama not to militarize South China Sea. So that was being viewed by the administration as a sort of betrayal. So I think my prediction is China will be more will take a more low-key approach in South China Sea. For example, with countries like Philippines, and joint development, with the Vietnam, joint development. At the same time, by the way, it's you could also create awkward situation between U.S. and its allies, right? To give you example, Australia, right? Military, politically, Australia, very strong with the United States. John Howard, the former prime minister, said on record, we are the deputy chef of the United States in Asia Pacific. But economically, they are so depending on China, right? Over 1/3 of export going to China. So I think country like Australia, they also understand the issue in the long run is China wants U.S. to leave and U.S. doesn't want to leave. So this is more of, that's a long-term issue.
But you're optimistic because you said in the trade war, China will make concessions.
I think
in the South China Sea, you believe.
Well, China will show some constraint.
Some constraints. So essentially, the Chinese give in and the US and Trump win. Is that what you're saying? What do you mean by that?
Yeah. Well, that's consequential, though, in the following sense, which is, I would contend that our friends in Southeast Asia, and maybe Australia as well, have a degree of skepticism about China's growing role.
Yeah.
And they're looking for some leadership from the United States, and so headline wins, or whatever you want to call them, superficial.
I mean, Chris, if you think about that, if you're a small country like Singapore, and the best situation is to play U.S. against China, right? Because then you get more benefit, right? So I think even when you have a very good relationship with China, you still have this security exchange, intelligence exchange with countries like Singapore. So I think countries in Southeast Asia, they always want to hedge themselves, no matter what.
Sure. Well, I think that's completely appropriate in their national interest. But I think there is a desire, and I think the TPP was an expression of that.
Let's talk about TPP.
Yeah, there was an expression of that, which was to make sure that the United States continued to have an active role in the area and promote a certain kind of business environment and trade environment and all of that.
By the way, do people in this room, they care TPP? Yeah. So maybe I just quickly explain to people in this room, right? TPP initially started by few countries, about, I forgot, 15 years ago. I think Singapore, Chile, New Zealand, a small country, I think Brunei maybe. So initially just a regional trade arrangement, treaty. But once the United States decided to join, of course, that has changed the whole landscape because US is the biggest market, deepest market. So now everyone was on the bandwagon. So Trump decided not to join TPP. So the whole thing almost collapsed. But then Japan took the leadership. So we got a new TPP, which is not so much different from the old TPP. And the invitation to the United States is still there, but I don't think US would join TPP, right? But other countries.
Of course, China is not a member.
China is not a member, and China, I would say, is not qualified. But I think China now is looking at TPP with more open-minded approach, right? Because again, the issues like state-owned companies, labor standard, I mean, China has to make some tough choices. But my prediction is this thing actually can become quite significant because a country like Malaysia, Vietnam, they will make sacrifice, service sector. So they will do well in new TPP. And country like Thailand will join TPP. Country like Indonesia, the largest economy in Southeast Asia, will be part of that. South Korea may not because this relationship with Japan. South Korea, Japan, they hate each other. So South Korea won't join. But then China, I think, will look at it more favorable. But China doesn't like leadership from Japan. So that's another issue. UK potentially could join this new TPP.
They may need to.
Yeah, they may. Yeah. So so I think I'm glad you brought up the issue of TPP, right? I think this is exactly what you said earlier. China is experiencing some pushback, right? So that would force China to change. I always say, big countries, they need to learn how to view things through other people's lens. In general, big countries are not good at doing that. Small countries, they have to, otherwise you get crushed, right?
I would say that applies to all big countries.
Yes, including our own. Let me just have one quick follow-up on that. So I would agree our own country could learn a few lessons as well, but I would say the one thing that's missing from TPP is what had historically been the single largest proponent of the free trade organization that we built, frankly, in the post-World War II order. And so to the extent that we're sort of receding, or at least there's a perception of our recession from this role, that changes the calculus for those guys, and it changes the calculus for China, because China's dealings with those other countries on an economics ground purely are very different from the institutional order I think we built here. So I guess, if I'm a business leader and I'm trying to allocate resources, I'm trying to think about projects in Southeast Asia, ex-China, outside of China, what's this trade war mean for me? How am I thinking about doing my business if I'm in the other countries that you mentioned?
Okay. I mean, that's a very good question. I think in general, when I look at companies in China, I use a degree of technology as a framework. If you are in very high tech, I think the relationship with the United States remain the same. They have to deal with the US. So trade war, no change. If you are in very low tech industry, auto parts, all these companies, previously you may have some factories in Vietnam, Thailand, even in Mexico. Now you are saying, if this is a new normal with the United States, am I going to boost my capacity in those places? I think the answer is yes. So that would force those companies to accelerate the migration to Southeast Asia. So countries like Vietnam and Thailand will be winners, not just because trade war, also because TPP. TPP would force them to make changes, right? But companies, in terms of technology degree, in the middle, very difficult to gauge. The example I use is really Foxconn's deal in Wisconsin. This $4 billion US. From what I heard, right now not much happening, because even you got this subsidy from state of Wisconsin, how do you find qualified engineers and technicians? That's very difficult.
One quick question from me, and then pass to you, and then perhaps we open it up. One big issue in Chinese-American, Chinese-Western relations is also always Taiwan. You are an expert, as you know, as I know your wife is Taiwanese, so you have domestic discussions about that. We are, in the West, we are scared that the Taiwanese issues, which is very sensitive for China, may lead to some military conflict. And the Trump administration seems to be cozying up to the current Taiwanese government much more so than the Obama administration. There's military aid deliveries, there is maneuvers which may take place. You know, there is an American representative coming to the opening of the American Institute in Taipei, and so on and so on. Do you see that as well, or is that an overinterpretation?
I think, first of all, before I answer your question, I do have a personal disclaimer. I'm from Beijing. My wife is from Taiwan. So we have achieved the unification many years ago. But on unification, we actually take very different views. My wife, she wants to see a faster unification. I'm more cautious, not because I'm not a patriot, but I think you need competition, not just on the economic front. You also need a competition on the political front, right? So the democracy in Taiwan right now actually is even more robust than what you see in the United States. KMT is really just like Republican Party, and DPP is like Democrats. So I think this is a good experiment, and I don't want to ruin that in the short term. So actually, I prefer status quo. A lot of people in mainland hold the same view. I'm just more open. So on Taiwan, clearly, potentially, we could have a flashpoint if economic reform in China incurring some setback, right? Politicians may want to turn country more nationalistic. I wouldn't rule that out. But I think, but I'm less worried about potential conflict. I mean, I do have a home in Taiwan right now. I don't intend to sell that.
So Xi Jinping's legacy will not be, or his objective, ultimate objective will not be the unification of China?
I hope his legacy is taking the Chinese economy to the next level. I mean, really creating this indulgence demand, right? I mean, like a little bit like the United States. People are optimistic, they are inherently upbeat, and we have a lot of work to do. So I don't think unification is I mean, personally, I really don't think unification is that urgent.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, so I guess my final question will be to sort of challenge your title of your talk, which is whether this is really something deeper that's imminent or growing, and the sort of Thucydides trap is sort of in the back of that. I mean, in talks I've been having with some U.S. military leaders, I'm sensing a greater degree of anxiety about things that we've spoken about in terms of neighboring seas and that sort of thing, technology, AI, all these kinds of considerations. And then in my travels, especially this summer and fall in China, I'm also hearing expressions from people that may otherwise be positively oriented towards the United States, private sector, business leaders, that sort of thing. I kind of concern about whether what we're doing in response is kind of a precursor to a Soviet-style containment or something. Where do you see that? I mean, do you feel? Is that sentiment that I sort of am tasting a bit? Oh, sorry. Yeah.
Yeah, you need to. Yeah,
oh, my apologies. Yeah. So a precursor to a Soviet-style kind of containment. Sorry. So whether that's the sentiment I'm kind of hearing from an anecdotal sense, and I want that is that sentiment about what this trade war may mean in a larger sense.
So
widespread.
The Chinese believe.
Yeah, is that widespread? Is it something that's bigger? Is that Thucydides trap being fed sort of by other forces, or is there a real deep kind of concern about this breeding? I mean, I understand that's not where you think this is going to go, but I'm asking about the sentiment towards this among people with whom you're doing business.
So, I mean, as you know, right, China is a very big country. A lot of my fellow countrymen are not informed. That's why actually China can't have democracy in the short run, simply because actually most of my fellow countrymen are not informed. So it's embarrassing to admit that, but that is actually true. That is very true. So clearly, a lot of Chinese, they feel trade war is about containment, is about this preemptive move led by the U.S. to slow China down, right? That's true. So what you have heard is true. What I feel, I think, first of all, is human nature, right? If you are number one, you don't have a lot of incentive to, just like if you are the best student in the class, do you want to know other students what they are doing, and particular people who are not number two or number three? No, right? Human nature. So I mean, really, for a very long time, I think that's really the relation between China, just like relationship between China and Japan. Because after World War II, Japan was always number two, so Japan was not used to that being number three, right? So now Japan is beginning to get used to number three, and I actually been saying this along with some of my friends. China should be a wise number two. Right? What's wrong with being number two, right? I think a lot of people in China, they think like me. So China is a big country, really. But I don't see this potential conflict with the Soviet, because Soviet Union was strong militarily, but economically, it was a basket case, right? I mean, toward the end of 1980s, they even couldn't pay for soldiers and people in state-owned enterprises. I don't think China would overstretch itself, right? As I said, that's why maybe you want to read that Asian Godfather book. I mean, Chinese want to make money.
Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
I think we can agree on that. Making money is not a bad idea.
Okay.
So let's open it to the public. Yes, please. This gentleman with the beard.
Gentleman with beard, okay.
Thank you very much. It's been fascinating. And in the spirit of learning from another person's perspective, I thought one of the most interesting slides you showed was the slide of the high-speed trains.
Yes,
that
high-speed
have been
train.
built throughout the country in a totally different business model. A business model that did not put profit first. And it seems to me that China could have a strategy in which they will basically be able to win any trade war by manipulating their currency. I just got back from Shanghai. In Shanghai, the yuan is now 6.99.
Yeah.
If they simply allow it to go to 7.5, we will buy everything they want, irrespective of a 25%. And this is just like the high-speed trains. Costs them a little money.
So is your question whether there will be currency manipulation?
What's the question?
Okay.
Yeah. Well, first of all, I think China should depreciate the currency, not because trade tensions with the United States, because we got this domestic leverage, right? Just domestic debt. Ultimately, you need to resolve that through higher inflation, and which would put downward pressure on the exchange rate. So I think the currency will adjust anyway. But I don't think we should give Trump any more ammunition on this currency manipulation. In fact, Mnuchin actually made this point deliberately a month ago, saying China did not manipulate the currency. So I think the right strategy for China is depreciate the currency, lowering the tariffs, and opening up market, and cut taxes. But as I said, politically it's very difficult to cut tax. So you need to do those things to overcompensate no tax cut.
Thank you. Any more questions? At the back there. Yeah, just go.
Hi. In the past, the U.S. and China have had a synergistic economic cooperative relationship, but as both countries look to move into more competitive technology sectors like AI and quantum computing, is that synergistic relationship still possible?
It's still possible, but it is more difficult. It is more difficult because some U.S. companies, they need to look at China more as a domestic market. So again, I'm not saying this, right? So at some point, Americans could say this. I mean, American could say, oh, this market is not open up. That's why my share price is not at this level. And so precisely because the market is not open up and the market cap at this level versus current level, so you are really robbing me. I'm not saying that would happen, but potentially that could happen. So I think potentially you could see pressure from US to force China to open up the internet, for example. And that's something China is not prepared to do. So you have asked a very good question. So I think right now, in the short term, there's no answer.
Yes, please.
I have a question about the middle class trap.
Trap.
Yeah, I understand, do you see China finding a way to parameterize that to thread a better GDP per capita from the nation through some explicit modulation of that middle class trap?
Well, so far, the track record for developing countries to move away from middle income trap has been dismal. Only few countries have done that in history. And country like Malaysia, the average income today is not so different from it was 20 years ago, right? Argentina, another example. Brazil, another example. So it's not just going to be like this, right? This straight line. So China needs to do a lot of work, right? We have a lot of challenges domestically, leverage, reforming state-owned enterprises, and to somehow have a more favorable external environment. This cannot be taken for granted. So a lot of challenges. So China has a lot of work to do. But if China can achieve, China doesn't have to be as rich as the United States. If per capita GDP, I would say it's, let's say it's at $12,000, $15,000. US is about 45, right? Now, East Coast in China will be just as rich as North America and Western Europe. China is a big country.
Thank you. There was a question here. Can you bring the microphone there? Yeah.
Hey, so I know we talked a little bit about the Belt Road Initiative, but my question goes a little bit more to the geopolitical effects of the Belt Road Initiative. So, as you've seen in the Northwest state, pardon me if I pronounce the name incorrectly, my Chinese system, my Mandarin is really bad, but in Northwest state of Xinjiang, you've seen the Uyghurs often create chaos in a lot of areas of China. But a lot of this stems from the Belt Road Initiative in areas where there's a lot of development running from this state and also from the province of Tibet. And so I wanted to ask, can China afford to invest in the Belt Road Initiative and also feel the effects of these? For instance, you're seeing now Chinese forces go into Afghanistan and actually look into terrorist operations in these areas.
Right.
Can they afford to do this, or can they afford to, I guess, see the threats in the South China Sea, which we're forming a little bit from the 21st Century Maritime Project?
So first of all, on Belt and Road, I think perhaps there are a lot of hypes, right? So in essence, it's really not different from what China has been doing from early 2000 to 2012, right? The current government started in 2012. But every government needs a new name. So somehow this Belt and Road, right? So from Western China to Central Asia, then from South China to Indonesia. So then within a few months, even government agencies stop using the words of Belt and Road countries. So suddenly, Belt and Road covers everywhere. I tell what, right? So when I was talking to ambassador, I don't want to name countries, right? This is ambassador of a major country. He said, I'm a little bit troubled. Whenever I talk to your government, the discussion always let's discuss under the framework of Belt and Road. So my answer is, this is just cultural. Just like people in Beijing, the first question we ask people is, have you eaten yet? So it doesn't mean anything. So maybe you just say, have you eaten yet? Let's discuss then let's talk about football or soccer. Then you move on to, so I think this Belt and Road, right? I wouldn't say the strategy. If it's a strategy, again, China would face a lot of backlash. So even the government now is calling it initiative, right? So I think My prediction is, this is my prediction, I think this Belt and Road will be increasingly moved to individual basis, individual project basis. So what happened between China and Japan, I think that was very good. Because you don't want to be exposed to the criticism, as you said, geopolitics, government behavior. So very often I say this to Chinese companies. I said, when you go to another country, let's not talk about Belt and Road. Then they said, if we don't talk about Belt and Road, we cannot get the money out. So I said, well, let's talk about the Belt and Road before you get your money out. Then stop talking about Belt and Road after you get your money out.
Well, so may I just follow up on that? So you say Belt and Road has effectively been buried, or it's just a marketing strategy?
I think I think it's really becoming marketing strategy. Marketing strategy. Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't read too much into this.
What about the industry plan, China 2025? Has that also been buried and thrown out?
Well, I mean, somehow Trump, right, made this a big deal, made in China 2025. I don't think most Chinese officials have read that, right? So I think it's an inspiration. It's an inspiration. But very often when I talk to American friends, I said, we have a surplus of state planners. Do you want some of them? We'll be very happy to send them to you.
I can tell you. The China 2025 series.
Okay.
Seriously threatened.
Okay.
Yes, please, over there.
I have something really not proper to
That's okay.
China because we know that President Xi changed the constitution to allow him to remain in
Okay.
power for more than 10 years. So
Yeah.
you think it's a great thing or bad thing for China's development, especially its economic development?
That's a tough one. That's a tough one. I think in past many years, right, we have tried a different system. One system is collective leadership. So collective leadership, we know, you result in political gridlock. That's one consequence. The other consequence is it means we literally divided the country and divided the spoils, right? I mean, so that's too crude. So something has to be done. Something has to be done. So the other extreme will be no collective leadership. So no collective leadership, you also have a consequence because let's say previously 3 of us, we divided the spoils equally, 1/3, 1/3, 1/3. Now I'm far above you. So what will be your incentive? I think that's a difficult question. So I think you have asked a very good question. So I don't have an answer. So right now I think but what I want to say is people like you, I mean young people in China, they are increasingly depoliticized. So that's very positive. That means for you, ideology doesn't mean anything. So the hope will be with your generation. I think I also think once a country already opened up, it's very difficult to go back, right? I mean, I think whenever I talk to young friends in China, they always say, if there are no VPNs, I wouldn't be reading this. But because of VPN, so I got to read that. So I think I don't have an answer to your great question. I mean, all I can say is we are just moving from this two extreme, right? Either gridlock or too much control. So I think, but I think the system still has some flexibility. I mean, what's your question? How do you answer that?
Let me follow up with
Yeah.
with a question that gets to your theme earlier, which is I see a tension in the current leadership between, on the one hand, looking like there's a consolidation of power. On the other hand, many market reforms are considering continuing at breakneck pace, right? Both are in place. So who's winning? Are the market reformers still winning, or is power consolidation taking place and at the expense of market reform? Because I guess I would contend the only way you escape the middle income trap is via the institutional reforms that will allow markets to have a greater role in the allocation of resources.
I agree. I fully agree. I fully agree.
Quickly define the middle income trap.
Yes, so that's the idea that going from low income to middle income, as challenging as it may be, for the development process is far easier than getting from middle income to high income. You can waste a tremendous amount of resources. Corruption can be, rife, but you can still, manage to get enough things off the ground that can fundamentally transform your society. But from middle income to high income, you have to be far more discriminating in the allocation of your resources. You have to be financing the right projects. You have to be pursuing value and not just growth. That's much harder, and most countries struggle because now it's about institutional change versus just investing in stuff. That's harder, and the record is dismal. That's a fair assessment. So where do we see this tension in the market reformers and versus the consolidation of power?
I think reform is difficult everywhere. I mean, in the end, it's just human nature. No one wants to reform, right? In most countries, why you reform? So that's why you need external pressure. The difficulty for China is never going to be like Argentina on its knees, Turkey. So you have a country who is always saving more than you spend. So you never need foreigners' money. In a way, you don't need foreigners' money. So if I don't owe you money, who gave you the right to lecture me, right? So that's difficult. That's really difficult. So that's why I think one of the positive consequences of trade war is the external pressure. External pressure is the consumers. The consumers want to buy want access to cheaper imported products, right?
The question, and we talked about transparency, and the question is China willing to be played fair?
Okay.
That's the basic question.
Well, I think first of all, right, when we say fairness, right, I don't think China could foresee the development so fast, right? So that's why today China is still saying we are the largest emerging market. But because there's a high speed, I think China wants more voice, which is also justifiable, right? Because not so long ago, if you look at the voting right of China in IMF, China had a similar size of Saudi Arabia or Belgium. I mean, that was so ridiculous, right? So I think when we say fairness, clearly we cannot have the same tariffs, right? China versus U.S. because China is still an emerging market. But I do think China has to demonstrate concrete progress in lowering the tariffs. That's the first step. The second step is, as you said, IPR protection, but it's very difficult to quantify that. How do you quantify the progress? So maybe we can have Deloitte as a third party monitoring. I don't know how to do that. I don't know, maybe every now and then we review that. It's just very difficult to quantify that.
Thank you. And the final question here from Brian.
Brian? Oh,
Thank you very much.
thank you, Brian.
Well, I was wondering, obviously this evening we've spoken about trade, but as you point out, China is an extraordinarily large country. What is this in China? Is it just a small political sideline? When you look at Xi, President Xi, he's got these incredible challenges.
Maritime, yeah.
So how significant is it?
Well, I mean, very significant, right? I mean,
Because if you're looking at 500 billion, the GNP.
that's what I'm saying. I think really in the extreme case, if we just bring down the tariff to zero, what is the big deal, right? I mean, if we have zero tariffs for American products, I don't think it's a big deal. By the way, just to let you know, right, now Japanese are cutting tariffs of American beef. And I think, you can correct me, I think the tariff on American cars to Japan, I think is also zero. But no, it's true. But Japanese are not buying American cars. That's a different issue. So, but I'm pretty sure the import tariffs of American cars are zero in Japan.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Before we go, let's widely speculate. Christian, how will the trade war end and when?
Goodness gracious, that's a big one. So I got like 5 seconds, right? Okay. It's going to get messier before it gets better.
And when will it get better?
The medium run, whenever the heck that is.
This is a very diplomatic answer.
Correct.
I think it's going to be suspension of tensions after G20. But some of but some of these issues will be unresolved.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you, Christian Lucas. Thank you, Sitao Xu.